Thank you so much, Professor. And this presentation is more like a summary presentation, but I know all of you coming from different background, professional background and experience. So it's more or less like a classroom discussion where I also invite you to get your voice and share your insight of those issue in SLA. It's also directly connected with the first part of the lecture. So it's more or less like a conversation that we want to discuss with each other. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen? Okay, yeah. Thank you. So the reading that we read this week is about the three fundamental concepts in second language acquisition and their relevance in multilingual context. If anyone remember the three concepts, can you tell us the three concepts from your memory when you read the paper? Any volunteer? Well, if you remember, it will correspond very well with the first part of the lecture that Professor has just mentioned. And it's a little bit invite us to rethink about what we have known in the field and what lies ahead in the future of second language acquisitions. So I would say that they go beyond the three fundamental concepts and they challenge the traditional understanding of this concept. The first concept that they challenge is native-speakerism. The second one is whether we should treat our students as language learners or as language users. Now, if we change the terminology, what does it mean? What could be the impact of such terminology, a new concept that we propose here? That's very different from the past, the way that we perceive our students. And the third issues is the interlanguage versus emergent learning. So in the first worksheets, Professor also used the word interlanguage and explained that a little bit. Now is your definitions and whether you have any opinion in how it can be used and applied in your own teaching and learning. And like I say, it's beyond those three concepts. So the authors of the paper stress and call and give a new call for something called a social turn in second language acquisitions. So if you remember in the first part of the lecture, Professor mentions there is a shift from the individual differences to everything now revolve around social impact. And social environment of language teaching, right? So I put the question here asking you whether you agree with that or whether you have other opinion in terms of social turn in SLA. So the first fundamental concept that discussed in the paper is the native-speakerism and whether it is important or not, whether it should be acknowledged and embraced or not. Now, nowadays, when you look at the teaching resources and teaching practices, you see a lot of video that have the title, for example, English like a native speaker, speak like a native speakers, or how to learn like a native speakers. So native speakerism is a terminology coined by Andre Holiday. However, it has been criticized by a lot of scholars because it's captured the chauvinistic belief that native speakers represent like a cultural ambassador for Western culture. And there is the differences in power here and in ideologies, both in the way language is perceived through the native speaker, the power of the native speaker, and that also affect the language teaching methodology. For example, for a long time, direct instruction language drills really idolize native speakers. So it has been criticized for those reasons. But at the same time, Holiday also emphasized the need of the native speaker. He said we must recognize people's aesthetic preferences for types of English and types of speaker, and the possibility that they may prefer flavors from the English-speaking West over indigenous flavors for a multiplicity of reasons. Now think about when you learn English. Do you prefer the classes learned where you can meet native speakers compared with your local teachers, for example? And one of the advantages or the strength of the native speakers from the definition of who are native speakers that we listen in the first part of the class is that native speakers naturally know what is the preferred way of saying things. For example, normal English through books, through course book, it will say something like, you have to decide. But a native speaker who use English as a first language and socialize in the first language context will say something like, instead of you have to decide, they will say something naturally like, make up your mind. So when you study with a native speaker, there is something salient in their mind, and the thing that they use language very naturally in context, those should be something that the local teachers may have a hard time catching up if you put them in a comparison. So, but in a global world where English is used more as an international language or English as a lingua franca, now people will talk again and revisit the importance and the power distance demonstrated by native speaker and non-native speaking teachers, for example. So right now, another radical viewpoint is that the native English speaker need to adapt to non-natives. And somehow this is kind of like the debate and what is going on each side. So the question that I want to invite everyone to answer is, you can see in the chat box, I hope, is who are native speaker of a language and what are the pros and cons of being an English native speaking teachers. I know that some students in our class right now are English non-native speaking teachers. But now, if you can think of some pros and cons of English native speaking teacher, please put in the chat. So what do you think? You can put your answer to these two questions in the chat box. And let's get 2 minutes for you to write that what you think, okay? You don't have to put it in sentences. If you think something like pros and cons, you can also give just phrases and words. Okay, thank you so much for your contributions in the chat. Of course, I don't have time to cover everyone's opinion, but you will see that every one of us has different opinion when it comes to the definition of a native speakers. Where's your definition come from, right? So for Rachel, to her, English native speaker are people who grew up in speaking English and English speaker who use the common colloquial or formulaic phrases in order to express or articulate some concept. But for Veronique, she said that those are the speakers that I recognize about their membership to a speech community. So they seems to belong to a speech community. Even they have different background. For example, they can immigrate to the America when they was like 3 or 4 years old. They can become and consider a native speaker if the community acknowledge their membership, for example. And he stressed the importance of social cultural background, that people have to share the social cultural background because that underpin the conceptual base upon which the language is operationalized. So it's really share the cultural values and also the preferred ways of behaving and saying things that fall into the normative way of behaving and saying that you will be considered the native speakers. So that being said, you can also recognize that you may agree or disagree with some of the definitions. But when you put an English native speaking teacher in a comparison with a non-native one, there are some pros and cons. The strength of a native speaker or so-called native speakers are that due to their social cultural experience, they can provide a rich input of how language is used in context. But for a non-native speaking teachers, they focus more on the cognitive processing in how they navigate between two languages. So more importantly, they can also equip the student because they walk in the same path of learning, of how to overcome challenges, obstacle, over generalization when it comes to language learning. So coming back to the debate, we can see that actually they don't have to be in a really like a battle. Instead, native English native speaking teachers and a non-native one can complement each other and cover and offer values to learners in different ways and in different contexts. And which one will be more suitable to a language learner more would be a better option for the learner in order to become successful to achieve their personal goal. So that is the direction that the author in the paper kind of hints at. The second fundamental concept that is mentioned in the paper is whether we should consider that language teaching or second language acquisition should treat the native likeness as the end goal, or should embrace the process and the procedure of learning. So the paper mentioned the notion raised by Baflenko and Cook. Baflenko is researchers coming from a psycholinguistic background, and Cook is more coming from an educational background, but they all saying that bilingual learners are very different than monolingual person. So they have something called multi-competent ability. It means they can use whatever communicative competence in their linguistic repertoire as a whole in order to navigate and accomplish the task in a specific situation. So instead of consider them as a language learner and helping them at all costs mimic or imitate the native speaker as a goal, as the end goal, language acquisition should focus on how successful they navigate the communicative task. And they also have the own right and the own power as a language user in order to function in any context where English is used. So I think that also connects with the fundamental concept number 3, is that if we admit that we should treat a student as a language user instead of a language learner, then we need to acknowledge that their learning is non-linear. It can be ups and downs, and it can also develop into something that is quite different than the monolingual language user in each language. It means they can have their own unpredictable and also idiosyncratic ways of producing the language and use language for thinking. So that means learning is interlanguage and emergent. So the first characteristic of emergent learning is that learning is bidirectional transfer. So it's not just moving the learner from first language to the second, but also when they learn the additional language, the second language, it can also affect their first language production. And the studies have shown that actually the effect is bidirectional from L1 to L2, L2 to L1, not just only in linguistic forms, but also in conversational style, in the pragmatics. For example, pragmatic is how they use language appropriately in a context. So for example, the way they make requests after they learn English and they make requests in their first language, it can also adopt some characteristics and understanding like the second language culture, for example, and also conceptual mapping. So for example, patronize can be a very negative concept, but under the effect of another language conceptualization, it can become neutral to a bilingual learner, for example. So the bidirectional transfer has been demonstrated and documented in many linguistic study and conceptual cognitive study as well. The second characteristic of emergent and interlanguage learning lies also in the transfer of training. So in the past, usually the training and the teachings emphasize the importance of producing authentic and native-like dialogue. But right now, it's more task-based learning. It means that the teacher will engage the student in order to use the language to achieve a goal, to accomplish the task goal, rather than to achieve the linguistic goal. So the training now is focused more on engaging the student in the classroom discourse and kind of use the foreigner talk like a process of learning rather than a must that make the student to model the model text, for example. And the third characteristic is language learning and language acquisition will be treated more as a growth in student strategy in learning. It means it become more learner approach, and now it's included a lot of strategy in how to socialize better. So it's more socially inflected strategy. For example, the teachers need to conduct needs analysis to understand how individual students are better in some aspect or topics of English compared with others. So they have their individual preference. It's called selective learning. And those focus on how each individual student learn is nowadays more important than how a successful learner should be. And the last characteristic is to acknowledge that as a student, as a bilingual and language user, they have their own power and identity. So for example, in some situation, it is better and also fine if they prefer to say something and borrow some words from their first language in order to express their thinking about a topic in a second language. So these characteristics represent the emergent interlanguage learning. So that is what I just summarized. Now is the question for you. Yingru, can you help me to say it again, the definition of interlanguage?
Okay. Interlanguage was a psycholinguistic concept meant to validate learner errors by considering them not as reprehensible lapses, but as positive evidence of learning, that is, of the restructuring, generalizing, analyzing, inferencing, and testing of the hypothesis going on in the mind.
So acknowledge and really embracing their trial and error process rather than having a very fixed mindset about what learning should be. So these are the questions that I may ask you to, I may want to hear your opinion. Anhee, can you help me to read through the question?
Sure. Do you agree with the aforementioned way of thinking? Do you think we need such a non-judgmental definition that stress the coherence or inner logic of a learner's language who have not achieved sufficient levels of analysis of linguistic knowledge or control of processing to be identified completely with native speakers? Any examples illustrating interlanguage in your teaching or learning experience? Why or why not? Any additions, revisions, or modifications of that definition?
So there are many sub-questions, but more or less it just like prompt you to think about interlanguage. So more or less like, do you think it makes sense if you reflect on your own experience with teaching or learning, and whether interlanguage is more or less the way we should perceive our student linguistic knowledge and cognitive control of the two languages. So I will give you some time to think about your opinion to these questions. And in the chat box, you will see that I put a link to a form. So please, you can also write down your note and submit it to the form as well. So I'll give everyone 3 minutes to write your thought about these questions. All right, so one more minute. I see that one person submitted the opinion. So if you, again, you don't have to write the full sentences. Just let me know what you think, some keywords. If you haven't clicked submitted, you can do it now. So let me summarize what we have. So it's not just only the subjective opinion of the writers, but more or less like what the research is telling the teachers right now, that interlingual is a real phenomenon. So these are great opinion that I think. So one opinion is that interlingual concept is not just only used and applied for bilingualism, but children do the same and go through kind of the similar struggle when they learn their mother tongue. So it does make sense that when they learn the second language, there should be more acceptance and patience being paid. Another student say interlanguage is a good concept because it's helped the teachers to shift the mindsets from treating the student from a deficit, going from low level of proficiency to high, to a more like a growth mindset, like everyone can be successful. And to a certain extent, language is going through a meaning negotiation in like in competence rather than just only linguistic performance. Another answers that I really that I also like is not just only inside the classroom, but also a school setting. So not just only the relationship between teacher and learner, but also at the school level, we need to understand that language learner will eventually become language user. So actually error is good. They learn from the errors, and there should be the error should be seen as a teaching prompt to build and scaffold the knowledge. And maybe it's not grammatically accepted, but it can be also be socially accepted and understandable. Then there's some room for the student to encourage student to continue producing the language before they become fluent, before they become accurate. So at the school setting, they also have to understand that natures of language use as well. And it also helpful to consider that through interlingual, students are supposed to make strategic choices of thought instead of being limited and afraid by the ideologies that the society of native likeness put on them or impose on them. So what do you think about this opinion? But definitely, I will put this opinion again after the presentation. There's some thoughts going on over there. It can also be a topic of your final project or how you use these changes in SLA in analyze your data. So think about that. Let me go back to the next slide. So providing what the three fundamental concepts we have revisited, we all agree that they need to be revisited and changed in order to stay updated to what is going on in the field. So the field right now is going toward a social turn in second language acquisitions. It means that learners have agency and they should be engaged in actively in activities that allow them to actively construct their own learning contexts and their own interactions. Also, we will hear more about what's going on when they making sense of the language and what is going on inside those dialogue when they interact with other language user, other peers. So there are some new concepts, for example, mediation, proximal development, internalization, individualized internalization, collaborative learning, collaborative dialogue, project-based learning, inquiry-based learning. Those are all the products and lies in the belief that learning is constructed through social interactions. Also, we are moving to the social turn. It means there are a lot of unpredictable variables, and it more towards we call chaos complexity theories that is raised by Larson Freeman. So she said that language is a dynamic set of patterns, and those patterns only emerge from use, not just only from linguistic drills, but from actual use. Language using patterns adapt to context of use. So more or less important in a classroom is that it's not just only linguistic model text, but also allow them to see how these structure can be applied in different contexts of use, different scenario, different situation. Also, learners use their language resources to respond intentionally, so their agency, to the communicative pressures presented by other interlocutors. For example, the way that they speak with their classmate will be different with the teachers. So some affective factors like anxiety or the pressures that created within the learning environment also matters. One of the last thing is that stable patterns will also emerge from the bottom up rather than top down. So top down is mean that we have a syllabus, we have topic to teach, but what is the learning outcome will also be bottom up. It means we have also need to rely on the data and the language that the student generated, which are very emergent, contingent, in order to modify our next lesson and engage their participation. So that is how language teaching should be. And last but not least, learner plays an active role in language development. Because of that social turn, we will know that for research, now we should look at more like conversation produced inside the classroom setting and pay more attention to how learners use language to socialize. So you can see in this in these pictures, these are the variables right now that move away from not just only descriptive linguistic, the content, but also the social variables that affect learning. So you can see that learning should not just only, like I say, be behind the doors, but also in measure level, like how they use that in their community, and not just only academic purpose, and also macro level, like how the society that they live perceive bilingual power or treating bilingualism still at a deficit from a monolingual perspective. So these are the variables that right now we need to look at, and not just only one slide, one type of student population or one class or one program, but also right now research focusing on the social turn of second language acquisition, look at how these variables affect student learning and teacher teaching longitudinally throughout the time, throughout different contexts. For example, now the student learn online platform, or now students have study abroad. Besides, learning English as a foreign language. So those social cultural activities gonna also affect their second language, or right now not just only second language, but more or less like a multilingual development as a whole. Those social integration and participation will also inform us about their non-linear trajectories that they take. And this is where I end the presentation, because these variables we will visit it again in other topics, but have a general understanding of what's going on in SLA right now is the purpose of the paper. So a case study that they demonstrate is how, as a teacher, you should teach when your student going outside of them use Spanish, use English, use Vietnamese, for example, different language in different contexts of use. But when they come to class, they only be judged and assessed in English language, particularly, right? So the multilingual reality and the social variables really urge us to rethink what we mean by second language acquisition. So do you think that these changes is valid and these changes become positive? We need to also make that turn. Do you agree or disagree with that? I hope you have the answer now after listening to the summary of this paper. Thank you so much for your attentions.
All right, thank you so much for this summary, and I really appreciate that you highlighted some important points in this summary and related that to what I talked about. Okay, so we have some time, half an hour or something, and please take the